Great. I think we're live. So, good evening, everyone. I'm Henry, and I'm a piano student here at the Royal Northern College of Music. And I'd like to start by thanking you all for joining us this evening and to say hello to everyone watching live on Facebook and YouTube, and to all my fellow students and staff at the RNCM joining us on Zoom. I'm delighted and honoured to welcome Pierre-Laurent Aimard here to this Q&A session tonight. Pierre-Laurent is widely acclaimed as a key figure in the music of our time as an interpreter of music from all ages. He has worked closely with many of the major creative forces of the century, from György Ligeti, Karlheinz Stockhausen and György Kurtág to Elliott Carter, George Benjamin, Pierre Boulez and Olivier Messiaen. So welcome, Pierre-Laurent.
Hello, nice to meet you. Thank you.
How have you been the past few months or year? How has it been for you? And whereabouts in the world are you joining us from this evening?
I join you from home, and home for me is Berlin, Germany, like for many musicians from the entire world. Well, I've been here unexpectedly much since almost 1 year for the reasons you know. And for a concertizing musician, this is both a strange new state, new way to live at the same place somewhere and to be home most of the time, and a kind of privilege to discover dimensions of life you are not used to in terms of continuity, closeness to your family, if you have one, what is my case, and the chance to work on a very stable and disciplined basis. I found also this troubling period, very destabilizing, of course, and therefore extremely interesting, bringing us to think, more deeply than ever, to be in contact on different ways and to try to imagine a future world on an even more radical way than usually. So I think a huge crisis, giving a lot of chances and giving us the opportunity to try to be creative for an interesting future with very different dimensions, really.
It's fascinating to hear how it's been for you, and to hear of this wonderful idea of from a crisis, we have all these other ideas and dimensions. I mentioned earlier about your work with many leading composers, and I wondered, as somebody who has done a lot for the cause of contemporary music, I wanted to begin by asking your thoughts about how we bring contemporary music to a contemporary audience, and maybe this idea of bringing music to an audience from all ages, but specifically here, the contemporary music is very much even more a question in our minds now, as you've talked about reaching out in different ways, finding new solutions.
Could I start with a question?
Sure.
A question from myself.
Yes.
Where does it come from that we have often less contact with living creators that live the same world than us and should bring the artistic answers for some of our questions, than with big figures of the past, who brings us very often backwards to the past, sometimes with a lost nostalgia, but maybe not necessarily always for the best. Let's imagine if this was the same thing in the sciences, we would have serious problems. When it happens in politics, we have also frightening problems. So shouldn't we look maybe not at the specificities of contemporary artistic creation, but maybe at the problematic of our education in general? And could I ask, I see the thing in the following way. Personally, I've been educated from years old on, in terms of music, on a large-minded way. My first teacher, we were at the start of the 60s, taught me not only Bach, Schumann, and Debussy, but also at the same level, music by Boulez, Stockhausen, and Xenakis, as well as music from North Africa or India. For her, it was normal to educate a young person with a contact to different cultures, and especially with the most recent cultures. Consequently, I must say for me, it's as natural to listen to music from today as from music from the 18th century, if not more natural. Therefore, I find always strange that music that speaks to me, like music of today, doesn't speak to so many people who are, as we say, well-educated and often open-minded people. So aren't we maybe too formal, too conservatives, not creative enough in our education in general in the world, so that we are artistically shifted, what brings us not to be very often up to date with our arts. This is not only the case in music. If you speak with painters, this is also very often the case. The big institutions for these kinds of arts are all also very academic and very conservative. We have less problem if we speak from modern dance or modern theater, that have less communication problem with a certain amount of audience. I mean, the specialist audience is not as reduced as for what we call classical music. But however, I think if we think to theater, do we want a way to make present challenging ideas? Do we want these challenging ideas to be ideas of the 19th or the 17th century and to be represented with these traditions? Or do we want nowadays ideas presented by people who speak in their gesture, in their clothes, in their way of expressing themselves in our language? Of course, what we need is the second one. So could we say the question differently? How would be our world if we had an education that would give the priority to contemporary arts? Of course, with a big commitment for the tradition. Wouldn't we have then a musical society that would be much less conservative, much more creative, much more open, and much more understood by young generations or people from any kind who have not got the chance to have got this education, but that would have maybe a much more natural drive and contact with our arts than if it is with this very traditional and very formal way. So this is my way to answer your question with other questions.
It's a fantastic answer, and it presupposes the next question that I was going to ask you, which is about education. And I've been looking into your contributions to the Explore the Score project, where you share your insights into Ligoti's music and your experiences working with him through interviews and recordings and interactive scores. Could you talk maybe a little about that project and what it is that you did there?
Of course. What can you do as an interpreter nowadays? Many things. How could it be really senseful? Several ways. You can discover very old music and make it alive. You can explain or discover how works music polyphony of Georgia or music from center of Africa and communicate it to the rest of the world so that the rest of the world discovers the richness in terms of cultures of certain part of the planet that are not so well known. You can bring music to play to parts of the society where it would be highly needed, like difficult parts of the suburbs or hospitals or prisons. Or you can be present for today's creators who need, for being heard, played, understood, interpreters. But then if you work with them, how do you communicate that? You can play, you can teach, you can communicate. You are a witness, and it's important to make this work of witness. In the past, you would then write a book. But in a book, you can't demonstrate, you can't make people listen to the music with the new tools nowadays. You can have that. So this project came from the worry after Ligeti's death, not to wait my own death for giving to everybody who would be interested what I learned from him and what I thought about his music. And I thought the best way would be to work on a site where you could get not only the musical informations, but all the satellite of informations around that can give perspective to this creation.
Well, thank you. It's really fascinating, and it's a wonderful resource that I'm sure everyone, if they haven't come across already, will be delighted to have a look at after this question and answer. It would be interesting to hear your take, thinking more about education, about the responsibilities that maybe, I mean, we've touched on the responsibilities that the performer has as this idea of a witness, but maybe also about what responsibilities or what can the composer also do in terms of making this music understandable or approachable through education, and maybe in society more generally. What role do schools and universities and conservatoires play in this quest?
About the last part of your question, institutions work on a model born, well, in the Romantic wave or post-Romantic times. And the reformations made in between depends on some individuals that have tried to open a basic structure to, well, many needs. So, for instance, if we consider what happened in the last half of a century in terms of musical reformations or revolution or events, we could consider some big trends, like, for instance, a very strong avant-garde creation in the last century, followed by now a kind of explosion of styles, so many different kinds of languages and aesthetics, what doesn't make, let's say, everybody's job easy, students, teachers, etc. A strong change in the way to look at some traditional music. I'm thinking about all the currents based on historical views. So period instruments, um, musicological information, etc., etc. So to try to go out of a certain type of tradition. And there is also, in some cases, the wish to open our institutions to other kinds of traditions. The jazz, since a lot of times in many institutions, some music of the world, some institutions with fantastic teachers for Indian music, or with some gamelan possibilities, etc. So we see that depending really on the open-mindedness of the houses, there is a panel of possibility that opens the game very much. For instance, one of these houses is the Paris Conservatory. In Paris, if you are a keyboard player, you can first be, of course, a cembalist or a pianofortist and to make proper studies, but you can be a piano player and you can then have complementary studies on pianoforte, for instance. But you can also have the complement in the Baroque dance section in order to learn yourself the Baroque dances so that this will be a part of your cultural education. So this kind of way to conceive an education is, of course, extremely rich and can fulfill, I think, the expectations of young people in a very open world where the multiplicity of cultures is the key. And in fact, this is the key question. Mm-hmm. How can we make institutions with big tradition and heavy traditions, because a high level of specialization, for trying to be always more open-minded and to be part of a world that is incredibly open in terms of culture? How can we deal with this kind of quadrature du cercle, the squareness of the circle? How do you say?
Yeah.
Yes. So I think this is in fact a big challenge, and this is a crucial challenge in a world in which we see that because the world is going so fast forwards, there are strong movements backwards in all categories of the civilization, the politics on a quite frightening way, but also all cultural ways, all the religious dimension. So we are in a period where we need always more comprehension of the multiplicity of the population of the planet and its culture. So this is what we could wish to have in our institutions, so that the small part of the global, very small part culture that we learn is taught not like a truth, like the culture, but like a small part of it with as much information as possible on other parts. This would be a little bit my vision of a possible development.
Well, it's a fantastic vision, and I think one in which we would all like to share. I wanted to ask your thoughts now about the reception and understanding of music, perhaps more generally. Maybe taking Beethoven as an example, as someone whose late music, it's often said, maybe the late string quartets are a good case in point, was not really understood until maybe 100 years after its conception. Maybe we've touched on this in thinking, okay, well, it was understood in a sense at the time, and it did speak of the time. And we've talked about the difficulties in the reception of that in terms of education. But I wondered whether, is this a phenomenon that is also the case with the composers of today, or is this a part of this pseudo phenomenon that's really surface level, and underneath it is what we've already been talking about?
It's a key question. It is, I think, in general, the question in any society of the communication. Which communication is wished and targeted? Which communication are we speaking about? So if you speak from classical music, for instance, and Beethoven is a very good example, are you speaking from the mainstream show society in which most of the classical music concerts are framed? In this case, you are speaking from market and from quantity. How many buyers? How large the hall will be? Will my hall be fulfilled? How many followers has this young pianist on his side, etc.? Yes. In this case, the last Beethoven is a loser.
Yeah.
Then you are targeting the quantity. Yes, that means in this case, you have to simplify the message, if not the content, because the goal will be as many receivers as possible. And there are rules for communications that shows that in the case of a very simple message, even simplistic message, you get much more chance to be followed, let's say, to be understood. Now, what is the goal of the late Beethoven, or of big thinkers, or of many people researching in their own field, their own territory, let's say a kind of truth that requires a lot of investment, of work, and of exigence, and of challenge, let's say. Of course, in this case, the goal is the sense, the intensity of the message, or the realization of artistry, of thought, of craftsmanship. Well, with certainly the goal that there is a certain communication. But the supreme goal, of course, is not the millions of sales that the records should do. Yes. So we are at two limits of the same continuum. And of course, I'm not preaching for hermetism, and a research of a supreme goal that would be for your own sake. We are speaking from events or from realizations to be shared. But I think at the end, the goal is that it makes sense. That means that people choose to share this for some reasons and not just for the sake of buying it because it has been bought already 2 billions of times. And then will be convinced that this should become a part of their life. Then the quantity doesn't make sense anymore. I mean, a religion that would bring light to a couple of 100,000 of people is a fantastic thing. And a religion that will bring to hell millions of others, not necessarily a better one. So I don't know why I speak from religion now. I am not religious anyway. So at the end, I think what's interesting in the case of Beethoven is that he was able to make a masterpiece like the Fifth Symphony, that is a very strong, deep, significant piece, but that communicates incredibly well because it is based on thematics that are understandable by anybody. It's extremely simplified. There are models of concentration of simple information, but with much potential. In his late pieces, he doesn't care about that. Obviously, it's like Bach composing Art of Fugue. He just, I think, look for the piece of art that makes sense for what is in his view the human existence.
Yeah, it's fascinating to hear your take and on these two outlooks. You know, one in terms of, as you've talked, quantity and perhaps consumerism, and one in terms of the communicating this message, and also to hear about how both can coincide with one another. In the case of your example with Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, I wanted to ask you about how maybe your process of learning a work, or when, you know, how this process of understanding maybe changes from first hearing a work or first playing a work to perhaps what we might call a deeper understanding or ability to communicate this understanding of this message to the audience, and what you think about maybe before even learning a piece in terms of this message, and then also about maybe what do you think about in terms of conveying this to an audience? Do you think consciously about how you want to convey this message and how you can make that understandable? Could you talk us through your process with that?
So you are speaking from the two parts of the interpreter, maybe.
Yeah.
The one who go to the tower with the composer, the monk, or the and then going to the marketplace to try to present the thing to the society. Yes, to play a piece, of course, is not simply to play the notes. It's to understand what it is about, to speak the language, to understand the message, and to take the decisions about how to present it sensefully through time with sounds. Because you start from a score and then you have to make it physically alive, yes? So that's a dimension of the work, and each of the parameters requires its own work somewhere. So the language, really to understand the vocabulary, the sounds, their articulation, so how the composer writes phrases or forms a piece, and the content, that means how and why he uses these objects and this articulation in order to deliver what we call a message. What does it mean? My God, yes. Emotions, fantasy, thoughts, speculations. Well, no word can really, every word would just reduce what it is to a too poor object. Then the question is, how can one bring that to life and comprehension to an audience? That means which audience? Yeah. Consequently, is it an audience that is a specialized one? Then what I should bring, they already know the piece. What I should bring is to characterize more my interpretation, my point of view. That means what specifically this piece means for me, and that has maybe not been translated until now. If I play for an audience that had no clue about that, how could I make it convincing and somewhere, if not comprehensible, at least touching, isn't it? Mm-hmm. A big part of it is how can I program it, in which programmative context, which other pieces of art can enlighten it and can help the perception. The other part would be also the introduction. How can I say a couple of words or write a text that can guide the audience and give a couple of keys in order, well, to come closer to the fact. So there are, in fact, two groups of choices that we can do. these choices are very different. One is more introspective, the other one more communicative. And to try to harmonize both, I think makes our function very challenging, but highly interesting, really.
So I have one more topic, one more question for you, Pierre-Laurent. But before I ask it, just to say that there will be some time afterwards for some questions from other students on Zoom. And if you would like to ask a question, if you could click on the raise hand button in the participants tab, and then Paul will pick some questions and unmute you. And for anyone watching live with us on Facebook or YouTube, you can post your questions in the comments section and we will try to answer as many as we can. But before that, we've been talking a little bit about, well, quite a bit about interpreting music where we have a direct connection today to the creative forces, to the composer. And I wanted to ask a bit about your approach to music of the past where we don't have that direct link. You've of course recorded a great deal of romantic, classical, Baroque music spanning right across the centuries. And you mentioned your recent Bach recordings, the Well-Tempered Clavier and the Art of Fugue, which I have to say I found very refreshing. And so I wanted to ask you, how do we then distinguish faithfulness to the composer's intentions from performance traditions, maybe built up over time, without thinking about what this person might think or what that person might think about how it should be played? How can we approach the music of the past with fresh eyes?
Well, you know that as well as me. All the informations we can get are welcome, of course. So they are, let's say, the transmissions, the traditions through pupils or witnesses. They are the more objective information, so all the letters or all the objective historical informations on creators. More than that, there are the other parts of their creations that tell us so much about them. There is, of course, more than that, the global cultural context in which they lived. And there are the instruments on which they played or created or listened to their music. And we can try somewhere to try to filter, to assemble, filter, and criticize these different informations, to try to get our point of view, and then to try to make it sensefully. That means made by and for people living today. That means with a complete other context, cultural, acoustical, instrumental, emotional, etc., etc. So this reflection I find is very interesting. But of course, we have to not forget that the further we are from the creators, the most, in general, more or less, we have lost information. Of course, we don't have much information about Bach, much less than about Debussy, for instance. But how much do we have about Middle Age music? In this case, interpreters should be investigators, very creative investigators. So the goal is to be respectful, of course, because it's interesting to try to go for the truth, if I may so. But we don't have to be stuck with this kind of fidelity, because at the end, it should be a human gesture with fantasy, with emotion, with creativity. And we should always keep in mind that even for living creators, you can have very respectful, well-informed interpreters that will deliver very different interpretations that will please the creator. Because there is not just one truth. And because for trying to look for a same target, you can have very different results. And this is why we can have, like in theater, for instance, like in dance, great interpretations or very good interpretations that are fundamentally different from each other.
Thank you so much for that, Pierre-Laurent. I'm going to hand over to, I think, Henry Page has a question.
I do, thank you. Thank you, Pierre-Laurent, for those interesting insights. I had a question regarding contemporary repertoire again, and I wanted to follow on from the point you made about the inherent conservatism in maybe the less educated listenership and the authenticity and conviction of new music coming from new thought and the ability to push forward. I wanted to ask specifically what you thought about repertoire, popular contemporary classical repertoire that maybe arguably drew too much from older forms or indulged in pastiche too much in a way maybe that could be seen as either simplistic or even minimalistic, not to confound the genre of minimalism. But thinking of Pierre Boulez's comments about burning down the opera houses because of the fact that opera perceivably had stagnated at that time. To what extent do you think that older forms and older styles have to be inherent in new music? Or do you think that for new music to be truly authentic and avant-garde, that we shouldn't refer to older structural and stylistic forms at all?
Well, our history is done from a multiplicity of attitudes, let's say. And this makes the richness of this world. For me, the mistake was the intolerance from one of these trends for the other one, whatever it was, and refusing on this way a part of humanity and considering that there should be a leadership and a kind of official establishment. I think one of the big discoveries of our era is the fact that there is no, or there should not be, a dominant culture or thought or population or religion or lack of religion or sex or genre or law, but that potentially rich world could be a world with a good understanding of the need of multiplicity, profound need of multiplicity, and consequently an understanding of each human being, of the different needs of other human beings. You understand that I'm not ready to condemn, to attack what may a previous generation coming from Second World War has done very often, like many other avant-garde generations, that needed for defining itself to burn all kinds of institutions, first of all, the history, the past. First of all, this is not my sensibility and my philosophy, though I am so attracted by avant-gardes through our general history. But it is not also, I think, the case of our era, when an important part of humanity desires, finally, this kind of recognition of the need of open-mindedness, an intelligent, respectful, and harmonious one, not a lazy one, not a one of hyper democracies that would consider that the most open market that would equalize any thoughts, any feelings, any rights would be an acceptable way of being human beings, but a one recognizing the strength of the different identities, but the wish of a common life. In other terms, I would wish on the planet to have what we had at the big periods of civilization in parts of the world where you had a marvelous mix of cultures, traditions, and populations. You know, what you had in Sicily, for instance, in the 11th and 12th century, what you had in the Balkans at the moments where it was balanced, what you had in Caucasus, also at the best moment of its history. That means an intelligent and noble and generous mix of cultures and population by the wish of a rich living together in the difference. In this sense, I tell you that I am interested about the manifestations of creation of many parts of the planet's population that is so diverse and so complex, even if I don't recognize myself in many of them, and I regret it, but well, I'm limited like any human being. And even if, of course, I make my choices, they are strong, they are defined, they hope not to be limited, and they try always to be in expansion.
Thank you very much. I do very much appreciate also the emphasis of coexistence and humanism and universalism as being key to authenticity and understanding. So thank you.
Thank you for your question. I think it's nowadays, well, I would say since especially a couple of years, 3-4 years, a crucial question, more than ever.
We've got another question now from Adam Swain next, if you would like to.
Thanks, Henry, and thank you, Pierre-Laurent, for speaking to us. It's terrific to have you here. I haven't really got a profound philosophical question, but I'm really interested to know about your next concert, which I see is the Kurtag 95th birthday in Amsterdam. I just wonder if you can tell us a bit more about that gig.
Yes. Well, Kurtag, who will be 95 years old next Friday, was born in Romania with Hungarian blood, lived most of his life in Budapest, though traveled and was in residence in any possible country, speaks incredibly an impressive number of languages, and is for me one of the most burning musicians on earth. All my life long, since I've got the chance to know him, 1978, he was a kind of intimate, permanently enlightening lighthouse somewhere. He belonged to a tabula rasa time and made his own tabula rasa and started to compose again from nothing in the 60s, let's say. Reduced musical pieces like experimental, minimal language tries, and constructed little by little fascinating and highly poetic world, mostly of the miniature, not exclusively, but mostly of the miniature. Being a pianist himself, the piano has been his companion, and he always composed pieces of his diary, let's say, composed for piano very often, then transposed, transformed, transcribed. That means there is a huge amount of piano pieces by him that tells the days of a profound artist and a master of the secret garden. This is one of the music I love the most on earth. And I hoped very much, I waited very much what was supposed to be a substantial Kurtag festival in Amsterdam in the marvelous Musikgebouw. And that has been reduced because of the reasons we know to one single concert in streaming. So my participation was to record in Berlin a bunch of pieces by him. They are most quite recent pieces from the last years. That means pieces probably never heard by most of the listeners. And well, there are pieces that touch me also because they are linked to his own story, especially his relationship with Marta, his wife, that was also his interpreter, that passed away 1.5 years ago. And I'm linked also to some of these pieces. That means this moment of music is really one of the flowers in my heart for me. And it will happen on the 19th of February, what is his 95th birthday, but also their wedding's birthday. So many intrications in one single moment of music. And this is really one of the seldom creators in our history of art that makes the silence speak with an immaculate intensity.
Well, thank you very much and all the best for the gig. I see that it's possible to get tickets online and enjoy it from wherever you are, which is, I suppose, an upside of this situation. So thank you.
Thank you.
I have one last question, if it would be all right, if you have the time. I wondered when you touched upon Kurtag and his many languages and how his music maybe as a language speaks very close to you. And I thought we talked a bit about the interpreter as a time traveler, almost as someone who brings music of the present and gives that meaning through perhaps simplicity or complexity and understanding that message, and the same thing from the past, bringing it to the present audience with something which speaks to them. I wanted to ask, going on from this, about what role maybe the interpreter has as a translator in terms of the language of each different composer and how one understands that language and communicates it to the many different, the multiplicity of languages and cultures across the world.
It's a large question. Well, if you play polyphonic music, well, I'm not a singer, so I can't play, I can be only a listener for Renaissance music, unfortunately. But if you play polyphonic music by Bach, for instance, one of the questions is, how can I make the polyphony not only clear and understandable, but completely alive and free, so that it will not be an embarrassing brainstorming for the audience, but an irresistible combination of life, isn't it? If you play, I don't know, music by Mozart or romantic music, the question will be, and I'm so schematic now, I'm sorry, I'm so simplifying. How can you be the singer? How can you deliver the phrase so that it can be irresistibly natural and speaking? Now, if you play music by Schoenberg, for instance, from the middle part of his life, the question would be, how can you deliver, how can you give freedom to the shout of the music, the shout of the explosion of expression of the music, and at the same time to keep the organicity of the form, yes, the unicity of the piece, etc. So each time you have different questions because the languages spoken are different, but the purpose is different, of course. Now, you spoke more about the language, and it is true. I'm sorry. When the music language was strongly connected to the spoken language, because voice, well, text and music and the voice were really the starting point, then I would say, and again, I'm afraid to be too schematic, but the way to organize your sentence was crucial. Of course, in German music, for instance, German language is so strongly structured and fixed, and the strength of the accentuation is so crucial. You have really to point on that on a very determined way. If you speak Beethoven as you would speak a French 19th century opera composer, Massenet, or even Debussy later, well, it's gone. In the case of the Hungarian languages, for instance, then the structure of the language makes that because you add always syllabs for functions, then the irregularity of the rhythms, that means in fact the pulsation and the way how the pulsation is dispatched is crucial. And therefore the articulation and the pulse itself are crucial. When you play, for instance, many French music, the coloration is extremely important. Why? I think because in France, Latin country, the hedonism is crucial. The fact to taste things and to have pleasure of tasting tastes or sounds. And nothing to do with the big German metaphysical tradition, for instance. And consequently, a pleasure of the sounds themselves, especially the vocals, and of the colors. That means the timbre. So in this case, if you play Debussy or Messiaen, for instance, the need of giving a rendition of the quality of the sound, the pleasure of the sound, and the definition and the charm of the color is essential. If you don't have that, then you lose a lot. So let's say there are very strong definitions. They are all, of course, too raw and too systematic, but that gives a little bit some direction in which you could work. And then the goal would be, in this music, for instance, in the music by Elliott Carter, very important thing is the time organization, the speed of the different layers. How can you give not just a right rendition of each rhythm, of each tempo or speed of the layers, but to make it alive and understandable for your listener. In other music, spectral music, for instance, where the focus is on the richness of the timbre itself, the complex constructions of harmonies. How can you bring your listeners to dive into the sounds in order to almost analyze them as you would analyze a great cooking, for instance, trying to appreciate the richness of inside, of structural coloration inside the sounds. In the case of other music, you will have to give more dimension to gestures, for instance. In some of them, on the forms, on the way how the piece is timeless, organized. On other musics, on the contrary, it will be on the immediate intuition. How can you give the impression that the feeling you are expressing has not been composed, but just flourished in you at the moment when you say this word? That, if I can say it another way, the flowers is opening by surprise at the moment where you play the piece. So I think creation is immense, and we are just invited to try to find a possible answer to these different manifestations of human diversity.
Well, thank you so much, Pierre-Laurent, and to everyone who has sent in questions, and to all of you who've taken part tonight. I'd like to say, and I'm sure we'd all like to say, a huge thank you to you, Pierre-Laurent, for taking the time to speak to us this evening. It's been really wonderful to have this conversation and to hear your very thoughtful and very thought-provoking answers. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for being here.